Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Brian Francis. I'm an audit partner with Baker Tilly here in New York. My main focus, before I turn over to this great panel here, I'll give you a little background on myself and our firm. So I lead the private equity initiatives here in New York, along with a lot of our partners here. And we really focus on providing services along the entire lifespan of a portfolio company and the private equity companies themselves, right? We are a global firm with our network of about 34,000 professionals deep globally. We think about us here in the US, we're 4,000 professionals that offer services from an audit side like myself, to the tax side, tax structuring, and even on the advisory side, right? So when we think about those three types of services, you cut them in a third each, and that's a good, respectful, designation of how large they are. When we think about on the advisory side, we'll deal with buy-side, sell-side diligence, dealing with the audits and tax, like I mentioned, also operational improvements and items like that. But I think that's enough on me and our firm. I think we should turn it over to this great panel here. I think how we'll structure this, to start off, I'll ask the first question, and maybe each of the panelists can give a little bit of background on themselves and the firm and answer that question, if that works, right? So starting off, and we're speaking about consumer products in the private equity space, and really where M&A looks like they're going to be going in 2020. Right now, as we look at the market space and who has buying power, there's really 5 generations, right? That's very unique, right, for this time frame. We have this, I think they call it the sleeper generation. We have the baby boomers. We have Generation X. We have the millennials, and now we even have Generation Z in the marketplace with true buying power. And that really brings a lot of fast-paced change, right? So when we think about the private equity space, thinking about the number of generations and really the pace of change, how do you see that impacting the M&A in the private equity space?
So I guess I'm up first, as I'm, the mic. I'm a bit at the tip of the spear here when it comes to looking at consumer brands, as I run a fund called SWAT Equity Partners. We are focused on early stage venture capital, which to me means 2 things. It's both a stage of capital raise, which we define as roughly seed to Series A. More importantly to me, though, is the size of the business, and that I define as at least $1 million of annual revenue, not cumulative, but annual, which is a distinction at my end of the market, and up to 10 to 12 to 15 million of annual revenue. So I'm early. I'm looking at brands that have products and services that they're selling and finding a fit somewhere in the market, but we are there to figure out, do they actually have brand equity yet, and is that brand equity something that we think can really grow and develop what we think its competitive advantage could be. I'm also affiliated with a branding agency, which is a little bit unique in my world. They help me really assess brand DNA on the front end when we're doing our due diligence. Everything from logo to name to color schemes and how they're messaging to their consumers across all channels. But then they also get involved where I need them to and as needed after we make an investment. So that's SWAT Equity Partners. There are 5 generations with spending power. It's a lot of spending power. I spend most of my time looking at things that the expected millennial and now Gen Z consumer is focused on. They have a different set of values, as you've all, I'm sure, read and experienced, than some of the older generations, and it does really impact the way in which founders are really solving a pain point, typically that they've experienced themselves, and that passion is what flows over into taking that big leap of faith to become an entrepreneur. But there are many examples, as well as in my own portfolio, where a founder decided, I really love to eat pasta, but I don't love the way it makes me feel, so I'm going to use chickpea flour instead of regular semolina and start a business called Bonza. And they now are selling their pasta, 15, 16 different SKUs in 12,000 doors around the United States in the mid-20s of revenue from 3 years ago in a kitchen. And yes, it does kind of happen that fast. But I think that they're really focused, again, looking at a millennial family, typically mom, who wants to provide, as you can imagine, a better quality product for her family to eat.
Right.
And that's what they're focused on. So I feel that I get to have a lot of fun experimenting with a lot of different brands out there. And some of the things that I've learned over the past 5 or 6 years doing so give me better insight, as well as my kind of branding friends, into how to understand whether this brand is ultimately going to resonate with a larger growing population.
Thanks. I can vouch for that brand. I didn't realize you guys were
You're
were an
Monster
investor.
fan.
Big Monster fan. So, my name is Michael Knapp. I work for a firm called Levine Lifeman Capital Partners. It's a Los Angeles-based private equity firm. Middle market investors, kind of anywhere from 4 or 5 even on the low end up to 40, 45 on the high end. We invest at 2 different pools of capital, and although we take a generalist approach to investing, so I'm not going to be as focused or expert insights as some of the folks up here on the panel. We do spend a lot of time when it comes to the consumer on franchising. So franchisors in particular, whether that be restaurant brands like Qdoba is an investment of ours in the past, but it could also be a consumer services business. So Candid Stone, which is the #1 competitor to Masajan. So a lot of different types of businesses across the franchisor marketplace that we've invested in over our career, over our firm's history. And I think, from my perspective, I really like this question. I think it's a really fascinating topic. The easiest way I think about the generational shifts is that my 35-year-old mother versus her 35-year-old mother, right? So, yes, the tastes were very different. Their desires from product category, what they wanted, were very different. But the action and process of acquiring that customer and providing that good to that customer were very similar. Today, the 35-year-old person is going out and communicating and interacting with companies in a very different way, whether that be through social media, direct-to-consumer marketing, all these we'll talk about here later. So I just think that it changes not only the products that you're going to make and then innovations around that, it changes business models and supply chains entirely. I think we're going back and forth if you guys are sharing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie. I am Vice President at the Carlyle Group. I specifically, Carlyle more broadly, you're probably familiar, large alternative asset manager. We have over 225 billion of assets under management across the world. But I specifically sit within our U.S. buyout fund. So it's our $18.5 billion investment vehicle where we have 5 industry verticals that we're discreetly focused on. I specifically sit within our consumer media and retail team. So I spend 100% of my time in those sectors alongside my colleagues. And while we are focused probably on, or definitively on the other side of the spectrum in terms of the size of investments, we're generally looking at putting a couple $100 million of equity to work in any given deal. That said, I think our mandate is much more flexible than an initial perception of a large buyout fund, particularly within the areas of consumer and media and retail, where we recognize the pace of change is evolving so quickly. And so historically, the deals that we've done and have a lot of success with have been both minority and majority deals, also a number of deals alongside founders and entrepreneurs. And so fundamentally a bit more growth oriented in the way that we want to support the value creation of the companies that we invest in. So we've invested in Beats Electronics alongside Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine, OGX Shampoo alongside 6th Generation hair care professional, alongside a number of others. Montclair in Europe is another good example. But I think this question around the diversification of the buying power across a number of generations is one that we spend a lot of time on. And I agree with what's been said so far. I think one way that I've seen this play out and that we're focused on in particular is how it means, or how the distribution channels have evolved accordingly. And so a lot of this is contingent on the technology penetration across different generations, or how that might differ. Because we have a couple of generations where technology might still be a new way to purchase, and it's certainly not the norm, and it's not how they've grown up. And then there's a couple of other generations where I would say in the middle there, where The technology enablement is still somewhat of a surprise and delight factor. When you have the ability to seamlessly connect across different channels, that's a great thing to have. It's not what you were born with, it's not what you grew up shopping, or the means through which you grew up shopping. But then there's a younger generation that's really coming into buying power in a big way, and their table stakes expectation is that you can buy online, pick up in store, or discover on Instagram or social, and then buy online and return in store, and you name it. And they're interacting across channels, and the expectation is that they can do that seamlessly. So I think that puts the onus on brands to really make sure that there's a consistent experience, and that you're targeting your go-to-market strategy accordingly. And also, I think you have to have a clear view of who your customer is and where they're shopping and how to target that accordingly. And from our perspective, it's interesting because there are a lot of brands who are still, that we see that are still in early stage and are in more of a test and learn approach. And I think that's great, but we're at the scale at which we're investing, really looking for healthy unit economics and the clear ability to scale.
Hi everyone, Zach Kurtzman. I'm a vice president at TZP Group. TZP is a lower middle market private equity firm. We have $1.6 billion in capital that we're investing across three main strategies: a small cap buyout fund, a traditional buyout fund, and then a growth equity strategy, so we can span in terms of investing in EBITDA negative businesses that are investing in growing through sales and marketing, all the way to business with EBITDA of 40 million plus. We primarily, our strategy is focused on partnering with founders of businesses and management teams who, as part of the transaction, are going to reinvest alongside us, so that we're all aligned going forward in terms of strategies and the next 5 years for the business. Over the last couple of years, we've built out a portfolio operations group to try to differentiate, I guess, our value to potential business owners. And the group really focuses on pain points that we see across our portfolio, whether it's building out sales teams, transitioning from a brick and mortar model to a digital model. So we try to bring on full-time professionals who can help our portfolio companies do that, and we've seen that bear a lot of fruit over the last couple of years. From an industry perspective, we're a little more generalist, like Michael and his firm, but we do have a focus on consumer as well. Some of our investments, we recently did a deal called Christie Sports, which they are a retailer and they rent ski equipment on the West Coast. We also are investors in a company called Sattva.com, which is a high-end luxury mattress retailer, purely direct-to-consumer online business. They compete with likes of Casper and Purple, just on the luxury mattress side. Another investment is in Triangle Home Fashions, which is less a direct-to-consumer brand, but more of a company that sells through a lot of the wholesalers, both online and offline. So think Amazons, Wayfairs of the world, as well as your TJ Maxx of the world. And lastly, Asos, which is a premier performance cycling apparel company. So our investments really range on the consumer side. And so just getting back to your question on the generational shift, I think, if you take a step back, right, when you're evaluating an investment from our perspective, you want to make sure you have a very large and growing addressable market. So when you're making an investment, you want to make sure the addressable market is more of a tailwind than a headwind. And so I think that's when you think about who is really your target customer across the different generations. And so as an example, we've looked at a lot of businesses that legacy products are focused on older generations, and they spend a lot of resources trying to transition to the younger generations. And so in that scenario, we have to get comfortable whether that is something they'll do successfully or how much investment it'll take. So that's where we focus in terms of evaluating whether the company will benefit from the generational changes. So that's one way, and then I'm not going to cover again the different consumer channels, because I think that was covered some of the other panelists.
Thank you, great. And kind of parlaying this conversation a little bit, and keeping with the trend of fast pace of change, right? when we look at the market right now, and kind of some of them were commented, you know, as you were speaking, just speaking about Casper and Purple and those type of products, but direct-to-consumer products, right? Those have always been in the marketplace, but we've certainly seen a significant uptick in those in the past few years. When we think about the disruption that's bringing to long-standing brands, right? How are you really seeing the that shaping the in the M&A space here in private equity when it comes to their and I think, you know, Katie, you kind of mentioned it a little bit when you're talking about the social media have a large impact on that, and really the expectations of delivery of that product and return of that product, right, which was also discussed. How do you see direct to consumer and that really impacting the M&A space in this coming year in private equity? Maybe, Katie, if you want to start with that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's one we spend a lot of time on because I think clearly a lot of the market share is still largely with the large players. But there's a lot of growth and tailwinds coming from direct-to-consumer players, and so we would be obviously remiss to not spend time there. And one of the biggest impacts of the change in the rise in direct-to-consumer businesses that we've seen is that the barriers to entry in many categories are significantly lowered, if not lowered almost entirely. And so that naturally means that there's so much more competition across all of these categories, and so we are trying to be really discerning about where we spend time. I think the lower barriers to entry, the higher competition has very directly impacted the customer acquisition costs, which is a major challenge that a lot of these businesses are having. Clearly, if there are more players, more competition, it's going to cost more to gain that incremental customer, and then even more to retain them. And so I think that clearly calls into question this is a grossly overused term now, but the path to profitability and what it takes to get profitable or to have steady unit economics and to then be able to scale in a healthy way. And so we're looking at all of those metrics. I think we're also trying to spend time in categories where maybe there are more natural barriers to entry, or where there's very clear brand loyalty that's been established over time, because it takes a long time to build a brand and to build up brand loyalty. So we spend a lot of time on the consumer behavior diligence.
She's hit on many of the points that I would have brought up, but what I found interesting in the past, I would say 2 years, that I know will carry forward in the next 2 or more is, while it is absolutely not necessarily easy, but very inexpensive to start a direct-to-consumer brand. You can get your Shopify subscription, you can use your own generated content, start posting on Instagram, and all of a sudden you have an audience and a channel. To move beyond that is difficult, and where younger brands start to shine versus their competitors, because there are no barriers to entry. Figuring out how to grab and hold your customers' loyalty, which takes place in many different forms, is really the key to these brands' success. Figuring out how they communicate with that customer, what they've learned and continue to learn from that customer through constant interaction, surveys, and communication to continue to develop the next product line and or service line is critical. Digital communication makes that much easier to do and much faster to do, so that you can get feedback often. Staying true to your brand requires discipline and making sure that you're not having too many cooks in the kitchen, and in fact, new product development that doesn't feel authentic, because that, while it's also an overused term in this category, is absolutely true. And then I think what kind of the path to acquisition or exit starts to look like is how engaged and loyal is the community that one's built. And I think building that community is going to take getting offline and figuring out a physical way of interacting with those customers. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to open 250 stores to do so. You can really use the data you've generated from selling online to understand where your customers are located, where they're most likely to shop, and then look very carefully at the unit economics of that new brick and mortar place that you want to open to interact with your consumers. I think we all recognize as well that those brick and mortar locations may often be more of a marketing activation than they are a revenue stream that you expect to build and grow immediately and scale fast. They can be a great source of marketing, and you can, with the pop-up, now test what's going to work and where. So you don't have to make the longer-term commitment. So there are lots of ways that these brands and their very innovative founders are figuring out ways to communicate with their customers, to keep them, to start finding them, have them try, and then continue to figure out how to retain them.
Anything else, or we covered that?
I think the only quick thing I'll add is I think a lot of these direct-to-consumer brands, at least in some of the industry end markets that we focus on, the mattress space and Triangle Home Fashions, which focuses on home decor, home textiles, they really just scratch the surface in terms of taking market share. I think that's why there's so much competition and interest in doing it, because it sounds like a lot of competition, why get into this space, but really a lot of the legacy providers of these products still hold a massive majority of the market share, and that's why for brands that are successful on the direct-to-consumer side, there's just so much room to grow.
Yeah, and my other comment would be, our experience with a company called Sfera, so they're doing fine Italian linens, robes, towels, things of that nature. That was not a digitally native brand, right? So we actually had to kind of teach the company internally, build the resources around it, make the investments to allow them to go direct to consumer. And that, the tag on to what we're talking about next around management teams, it's just that it's hard to, if you're not kind of digitally native to begin with, it's hard to make that switch, and it can be painful at times. But it's also a way for an established business in the old school retail world to accelerate growth 20, 30 years into its existence, kind of have not a next leg up, which is a compelling opportunity.
Great, thank you. So segueing right into keeping on the topic of these new brands, right? And what they tend to have is less seasoned C-suite, right? So when you're working, and that's not a pro or a con, right? I mean, there's certainly pros to that and cons, right? But when you're working through the deal side, right, pre-acquisition, post-acquisition, how do you see managing that process, right? With maybe a less seasoned C-suite, both pre-acquisition and going through the diligence, and post when it comes to structuring that. Maybe Michael, if you wanted to start.
Yeah. Hopefully, Zach, you're able to come up with some thoughts on the diligence process. Because I didn't have anything to really add from it. I think we approached very similarly, regardless of the seasonality of that executive team. Post-acquisition, what we have started thinking about and creating internally have been things such as a chief revenue officer or a chief innovation officer, because once you go from, for example, in franchise system, we want to have 50, 75 units, that's what we're going to acquire, right? We want to eventually get to 400 units before we exit that investment. That's going to take tons of blocking and tackling, a lot of different type of operational, ticking and tying, and the founding team might not have experience in that. They might just be really, really passionate about the gluten-free pasta or about the buntini that they created. They love the icing, they love the cake mix, they love being out with the customers. They're not that excited or have any experience in figuring out how you're going to open up and launch 50 stores every year and year in, year out. That's really hard work. It's not easy to do, and it's not something you can learn, in a 6-7 week honeymoon period with your new investor. So what we have found is supplementing the team. Living Life in particular, we're not going to come in and make investment and remove management. That's not our MO at all. We really think the entrepreneurs that created the value today will continue to do so tomorrow and add a lot of value to the investment. So creating different types of roles for them where maybe they're not going to be the traditional CEO, they'll bring in a little more seasoned experience. That we found to be very helpful, but always a very collaborative nature.
Yeah.
I don't know, Zach or Katie, if you guys have something on the diligence front.
No, I agree. The diligence front's tough, especially with how much auction processes play into how we try to avoid them.
We need more than 8 weeks.
Yeah, we need some time. But I entirely agree. I think there are kind of two sides to the coin of having a shorter tenured executive team. One is clearly, well, not clearly, but oftentimes There's fresh thinking, there's innovative way of building business models. They're less steeped in traditional roles, traditional function areas, and there's a lot of innovation and newness that comes from that. The flip side is that what we talk about frequently is that being 10, 11 years out of the cycle, there are a lot of the younger, shorter tenured executives with whom we meet haven't been in leadership or decision-making roles when the economy hasn't been growing. And that takes a different skill set, that takes a different decision-making capability and a different way of managing a team. And so that's not to say that those aren't the right people to be in those roles. They probably are. But we spend time, but certainly after we're signing up a deal, spending time with that executive or that executive team, understanding their skill set, their gaps, because there always will be some, and how that skill set aligns with the value creation plan that we're creating. So is our goal to open 250 stores, and are they skilled at retail? If not, then let's either add someone who's seasoned at retail on, giving your same example, on the board, on the management team, and make sure that we're supplementing that skill set appropriately, so that where there are potential gaps, that we're able to tie those to where we want to actually focus on creating value.
And one thing I guess I would add, having seen both sides of private equity, between venture and leveraged buyout stage businesses and investing, is that at the venture capital stage you don't have control. So when there is a challenge and management needs tending in a way that's more challenging, we have to work very carefully on the relationship that we've developed with the founders to demonstrate the wisdom that collectively the investors see in making change. And that's more difficult because we just effectively and transactionally and documentation-wise don't have the ability to control and make change. So it's more difficult at this earlier stage, but that's also why we believe, founders are 75% of the evaluation equation that I use to assess making an investment, and their realism and kind of malleability is high up on my list of things that we really evaluate.
Yeah, I think the only point I would add during the diligence process where we really focus is trying to understand or view interactions with the team, if they're self-aware and have an understanding of where the holes in their team are, and basically willing to take guidance and direction from a partner. If not, it doesn't mean that it's not a good investment. It just may not be the right fit, for an investment firm like TZP. But that's where we really try to suss out in diligence, because it's very difficult to make changes if the team is not, open to them and self-aware enough to understand where they need help.
Yeah, we'll add one more thing. Move on, but I think that's such a great point, because the primary quality that I and most of my team are looking for in management teams is flexibility. Because the only thing that's certain is we're going to spend hours and hours and hours putting together our model and our investment case and what that growth plan looks like. And again, the only certainty is that it won't play out exactly how we put it on a piece of paper, and there will be twists and turns. And we want a management team who can adapt quickly and recognize where we need to make changes to the plan that we put on a piece of paper.
Great, thank you. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, move maybe a little bit over more towards the economy and what the real buying power in the core consumer market is right now, right, and where those trends are going. So when we think about off brands, right, and buying at discounts, maybe going to, and I think Michael actually even touched on a little bit. What are buyers at the age 35 now doing, right, versus your mother maybe at 35. Or whomever it may be, right? So when we think about Nordstrom Rack, TJ Maxx, even Amazon and Costco out there, right? How do you see the trends of buyers and the core buyers in the market gravitating towards discounts and those type of resale type products, and maybe even off-brand of higher brand equivalents, right, at a lower cost? How do you see those type of products and that type of buying trend that we see in the economy right now shaping shaping the M&A space in private equity. And maybe we could start with Zach on that one.
Sure. So, I'll try to give a perspective from, experience with Triangle Home Fashions, which is again, the home textiles retailer. So just to differentiate a little bit, Triangle is not a direct-to-consumer brand. We don't go and market online direct-to-consumers. We're selling through pretty much all of the online marketplaces like Amazon, Target, Walmart.com, Wayfair, as well as brick and mortars. Like think of your TJ Maxx of the world, Bed Bath & Beyond, et cetera. So from our perspective, we're definitely seeing growth within just the home textiles. Some of the top growers, right? So put aside Amazon and Wayfair, online, they're growing 30% plus annually. And I'm guessing that's the same across other categories, not just home textiles. But in terms of the brick and mortar stores who really have been successful, TJ Maxx, Ross Stores, Burlington, have been successful because they have a very well curated product assortment at a very reasonable price. And I think, just from some diligence we've done and work on the industry, the younger generations focus on, ease of purchase, simplicity of the product from a design perspective, and then, always having it available at your fingertips when ordering. So I think that's why a lot of those retailers are getting traction, but it's not all of the, mass market retailers that are doing well. Obviously, there's a lot, big names we see in the news every day. Even though they set a low price point, they're not successful. And I think part of the reason for that is because they haven't fully taken advantage of, the omni-channel strategy of having a lot of brick and mortar stores, but also focusing on the online stores. So Target.com, for example, has done very well in terms of not only having the brick and mortar, but taking that brick and mortar footprint and bringing it online and making it very convenient for the consumer. So they're growing as a result of that, whereas some other legacy large mass market retailers have not been able to do that successfully. Because again, taking a company from brick and mortar to digital is very tough and very expensive. So the ones who haven't done it successfully and are kind of behind are the ones who are trying to see definitely slow down in declines in sales.
From my end of the market, I think the relationship between price and value hasn't changed. I think consumers are still very much looking for great value and affordable price. And what I've had a great time doing is finding those types of products that fit that profile with another something mixed in to their messaging. So, for example, we invested in a apparel business that makes cashmere clothing. That it's aspirational in consumers wanting to at an earlier age afford cashmere, but they are direct to consumer, so they've taken some supply chain magic into the way they source, buying actually the fiber itself directly in market in Mongolia, of all places. But that way they get to actually pay more for the fiber, and the indigenous people who are raising these goats and selling it, giving them a better life. But they then make a $75 sweater that is very affordable for an older Gen Z, younger millennial consumer who wants to own a nice, great piece of cashmere apparel, but not have to pay $2,000 for it. Many brands we could all name that are selling at that price range. So Naadam, which is the business that I'm talking about, Naadam, is a fantastic example of how to make affordable, aspirational luxury a mainstream topic for their consumers. When we invested in that business, don't tell Matt I've mentioned this, but it probably did around $6 million in revenue. It did $90 million last year. A lot of that direct to consumer, and that was a big transition for the business too, from its early days of starting to sell product. And we find that across the portfolio, and there's another business I'm looking at right now that is in the resale market, which I think is also an amazing trend that we're seeing converge as well with sustainability, which is important to that Z and millennial consumer, but it's in wedding gowns. So think of the Real focused purely on wedding gowns and the kind of stigma attached to having worn somebody else's gown is not an issue anymore. In fact, they would rather do that have an aspirational purchase of a gown that's much more expensive than they would otherwise maybe afforded or wanted to buy at a lower price point, while not having, 80 hours of resources and time go into making a dress that she'll wear once.
Yeah, those are all great examples. And I think from my perspective, I think Nordstrom Rack has done a really nice job in terms of kind of bifurcating their clientele and their customer set. So that's how I think about, again, I'm not as involved in the consumer space, particularly within products and direct to consumer as you guys are, but we own a business called Bracksmith Innovations, and they make sneeze guards. So, it's B2B business, but we very much have a premier product. That's what when we acquired the business, they were top of the line. And we said, well, look, there's a lot of opportunity to grow in this, for the best, where's the, better and good? And why can't we be a good, better, best strategy and go do that through M&A? And so I think there's opportunity to do that within the consumer world where you don't necessarily have to have everything have your brand. So it doesn't have to be Nordstrom and Nordstrom Rack. You can have other types of sister brands and underneath a larger umbrella that allows you to touch different segments of the larger audience that you're trying to target. And doing that through M&A could be easier way to do it rather than building it, just because they are two different languages. Like I think Nordstrom's and Nordstrom Rack is very different languages in terms of, if I'm a consumer in Nordstrom's or one Nordstrom Rack, and I would imagine if I'm your corporate CEO of those businesses, the strategy and model and mindset is very different. So I just think acquiring that skill set and capability might be a little easier than building it yourself.
I think that's a great point. And I think Sarah's example of the distinction, I think we're seeing kind of two forms of value in the market. There's traditional value, which is discount retail, et cetera, and there's still a big role for that to play in the market, and there's a lot of value that's being generated out of that sector. But there's also a little bit of a barbell where there's value. Premium doesn't need to be expensive. It's not necessarily premium in terms of price point. What we're seeing a lot is that consumers want perceived value for the money that they're paying. They might still be paying.
Great, thank you. And one last question that we're going to go through before we turn it over to Q&A with everybody. But changing topics again, moving more towards something that's certainly a bit more judgmental, right? And I think having a panel, of such varying degrees in the private equity space, when we think about size and the size of deals that they're operating in, is a topic of valuation, right? And we think about pre-revenue businesses, that Sarah may have touched on a little bit, right? And also all the way up to $100 million capital that you're putting into a business. How are you seeing the deal space and valuations and the methods therein changing in 2020? Or how do you think the trends are looking with that? And maybe Zach, if you want to start with that one.
So, I think there's a lot of experience in direct-to-consumer businesses, so I'll leave it to these guys. But I'll take it from the perspective of, again, a vendor who serves a lot of these retailers. I think when you look at the spectrum of valuation, I'm not going to give specifics in terms of multiples, but just what's less attractive and what's more attractive. I think the first thing we look at is, customer concentration, right? Is the brand or company heavy with the Amazons of the world, the Walmarts of the world? We see a lot of companies that right now are actually coming up and have built up $8 to $10 million of EBITDA, but Amazon is their only customer and they're selling 10 products on Amazon and they're generating $10 million of earnings a year. So very impressive, but from an investment perspective, very, very challenging because Amazon has so much power over you. They can constantly eat away at your margins. So customer concentration is something big we look at. And not only Amazon, whether you're country with Walmart, Target. So we like the businesses, and we would value businesses higher that are diversified across a lot of different channels. So no specific percentages, but very diversified across both online and brick and mortar. And in terms of the channels themselves, I think there's some brick and mortar that we talked about earlier in terms of retailers that are still attractive as a customer, but I think we prefer and we would value companies higher that are able to serve the online channel. So serving Wayfair, serving Amazon, it's not easy to do. You have to have a data analytics component to your business in addition to the actual product. And you also have to have a distribution component, meaning that yet somehow if somebody orders something on Amazon, you have to get it to that person within 48 hours to still be, on the first page of the Amazon listing. Because once you go beyond the first or second page, your company and that product specifically is going to have a lot of challenges. So, companies that can serve both the brick and mortar and e-commerce channel is very attractive. I think management team is critical, to what we talked about before, in terms of, more attractive teams, more built-out teams, generally have higher valuations, and then particularly vendors to the retail space. I think those who have built out their operations, from supply chain to design to distribution, and then again to data analytics, those who have actually expertise in all those areas, again, are more attractive compared to potential retailers who are really good at sourcing but are not that good at design or not that good at fulfillment. Is a little more challenging from a value perspective.
Go down there. I agree with all of those things. I don't know if I have a great answer to this one because it's hard out there. I've been saying for how many years now valuations are high and that hasn't changed. So the landscape hasn't changed significantly in my mind over the last few years in terms of valuations, other than to say that maybe there's been a little bit more of a bifurcation in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of high quality assets versus mediocre assets. But those high quality assets, the ones we want to be investing in, are going for incredibly high multiples. And so where we're trying to really pick our spots is recognizing that we will never, well, I don't want to say never, but we will not be the highest bidder for our business because we are underwriting lower cost of capital. We will be the highest bidder because we have a differentiated or unique angle or something in our track record or our capabilities as a firm that is bringing something different to the table that then impacts our value creation plan and allows us to accelerate growth to a greater degree. Carlyle is a firm, we don't have specifically a slate of full-time operating partners or operating team, but we do have a number of investment resources that we've invested in very heavily over the last 12 months. So we have Chief Digital Officer, a Chief Performance Officer who helps with talent and management team review. We have a head of IT, procurement, et cetera. And so how can we bring our expertise in all of those function areas to add value to companies, not to mention the 33 offices around the world and folks on the ground who can help with geographic expansion. We're trying to figure out how do we bring that whole suite of resources to a company to then allow us to be a higher bidder and maybe keep up with the competition.
No, I'd echo a lot of those comments. I think we're looking at cash flow businesses that have a nice growth profile. High quality assets are definitely trading at a meaningful premium to the balance of the markets that are assets that are in market. We haven't really gone to the revenue multiple side, so I'm curious to hear what Sarah has to say about how you think about that. And I really thought it was interesting how you thought about the 75% of your evaluations of the management team, and we don't quantify it probably as explicitly as that, but there are tons of intangibles that are involved to ultimately get you comfortable with where you need to be from a price perspective. But totally agree with Katie. You're not lower, at least we're not lowering our return expectations. We're just thinking about how else are we LLCP going to help our new partners in this company achieve the results that we've kind of put out on paper for ourselves.
So I guess the way I would differ from everybody else whose opinion I can totally respect and appreciate because I've been there, is that the hardest transition for me moving from private equity style investing with control to no control is that there are fewer metrics to adjust my pricing to. There are guides, I would say, and there are ranges that are proxies, but they're really not more than that. I would say when we're looking at investing in a business, it's much more a function of what's the founder comfortable selling percentage of his business for the amount of capital that they think they need to raise. And the twist comes when they've run their model, they've got a great at least 2 years, and don't bother me with 5 years projections because no one's going to know what is happening after 24 months. But sometimes they haven't included a working capital calculation, particularly in the CPG side of where I spend my time. So they don't really have a great idea yet of the inventory need in order to make the revenue projections that they've laid out, so they're light on the amount of capital that they need to raise. And then the negotiation becomes more about, we think you need 6, even though you thought you needed 3, and we still want to buy 20% of your business. So that's where I spend my time, is kind of making sure they understand that my model and my math is born from reality. Having looked across thousands of companies that are doing that, and being able to pass on those learnings, and then you just kind of end up figuring out how to meet closer in the middle.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, Jeff. So within like the venture world, that scenario comes up. Are you able to say, I'll give you your 3 and 20%, and let's have some kind of structured paper or something that I can throw in there? Or is there another firm out there that will get the 6 done?
So the competition at this level is a lot less fierce, no doubt about it. But I'm also at the seed to Series A stage, where we're taking a lot more risk. Business that, in my world, $15 million in revenue a year is a lot. For you, that's a month maybe or less. And so it's a lot fewer people willing to take the risk at my stage, which is fine, it's great, but I still need to pick very well after sourcing as strongly as I can. So that's why I found the dynamic to be interesting and different from, again, more of a traditional leverage buyout, or kind of minority growth, significant minority investing world. But there is definitely a discrepancy between the East and the West Coast. West Coast is a lot more expensive, largely because talent's more expensive. I don't think the West Coast has figured out exactly how to value consumer businesses. They're also trying to figure out a tech spin to how to value the consumer businesses, and therefore, funding gets done at higher valuations out there. New York is booming. We have a lot of amazing talent here and great companies and a lot more unicorns today than we have in the past, but they're worthy. We have a lot of other great companies here that are throwing off great talent that's starting their own businesses, like the Googles and the Facebooks. So I find this market to be great. I would say 75% of my portfolio is based in New York, or at least has a strong office of sales and marketing based here, and manufacturing or other kind of back office elsewhere. But I think that's the way I was thinking about this question. I think the only other trend that I would say has become more prominent in 2020 in my world is paths to profitability, as we talked about. And yes, it's overused, but now it's actually resonating with my founders, instead of them just spending like crazy with Subway ads and hoping the revenue will come. Now there's more discipline in the process, which is fantastic. I'd also say that the pendulum has swung back more toward less friendly terms. So less friendly founder, rather, terms. And a lot of that you've read about in the press, which is kind of really borne out with the fall's activity around the fall of WeWork. No, stop talking.
That was great. And before we turn over to Q&A, I think we probably have time for one Q&A. I want to thank Sarah and Michael and Katie and Zach. Really, this was, I think, very, very insightful. Thank you very much. And we have time for one question if anybody has any questions in the audience.
So I think it was Sarah, you mentioned sustainability was important to some of the other buyers. Just curious, for your portfolio businesses, how does that shape your policies and procedures when you think about eco-friendly, sustainability, reducing carbon footprints, et cetera, looking at those decisions, or even after you invest?
So I would not say it's part of our investment policy per se. It's more a function of what is more differentiated about this particular brand and the way in which they're executing, building a business with the model. Nadam is one example where that sustainability angle was a big part of their marketing and communicating with consumers, which gave them something differentiated. Everlane's come along and done something similar, but they are in more categories of clothing than we were at the time. We have another investment in a business called Repurpose, and they make plant-based plastic disposable tableware. So the cups and knives and utensils, but they are all made of literally plant-based plastic that's 100% compostable. So straws, they're based in California, in Los Angeles, where the straw ban began. She's been at it for 8 years, a long time in my world, but really now seeing, momentum behind her on the consumer's grasp of how big the plastic problem is. We're very, very, very focused on the brand and the potential that brand equity has to evolve. But listening to what's going on in consumers' minds, particularly the Gen Z and millennial buyers who find some type of impact that they can have, is an important part of their decision-making process, but absolutely expecting kind of a value for that is got to be a part of the business model too.
Thank you. There was one more question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it was really a subset of sustainability, but really packaging seems to be a big issue these days as people grab things on the shelf, and especially the X and Z and the millennials. And they will stay away from products that they know isn't packaged.
I would say the packaging front, I think it's a phenomenal space. I've seen tons of businesses kind of, in the market that are looking to exit that are packagers. But from a product side, it's amazing how much your cost of goods sold can go into packaging these days relative to the actual good. I don't know, like, do you guys with your extraction to your Ben business, is that a package that matters when it's delivered, not so much?
Yeah, I mean, our specifically mattress business, it was white glove installation, so it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not delivered that way, but for Triangle, I think it's definitely an important component. And on the sustainability point, I don't think the market at this point yet places a premium on businesses that focus on that, but I think in the future they will go there. And we personally at TZP do place or think higher up businesses, and as part of our diligence, focus on sustainability.
I remember the first time I got baked by Melissa, like that packaging just kind of blows you away. But you think about it, and it's the Dunkin' Donuts. Like when I was growing up, you got like they threw a bunch of little donut holes into a bag, and that was it. So it's just a different kind of phenomenon.
But the packaging has a big part of explaining the brand too. And there's an experience now, Casper kind of being a great example, or Warby being a great example of how when the packaging arrives, it's a big unveil, and it's a big moment, and that's great Instagram juice. So for the companies in our portfolio that do have some angle around sustainability, then thinking all the way through what the packaging looks like and how it's sourced, and it better be on brand in terms of its sustainability as well, is real. And the consumer is well aware of it and will have an opinion on whether you're following through all the way and being completely authentic or not.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks again, and we'll be around for clearly for a little bit for questions.
Thank you.